Okay, so now we're going to go beyond Pavlov with classical conditioning. So first thing that we've found since Pavlov is that we can actually learn the predictability of a particular event. Um, sorry. Um, the stronger the association with that particular conditioned stimulus, the more we can predict when that conditioned stimulus is going to happen, the more we're going to respond to that event. So we can actually learn when the stimulus is going to happen. That will actually increase the likelihood of our response happening. The conditioning also best occurs when people actually understand the relationship between the stimuli. For example, in class when I squirted the student with water after I said the word can. Imagine, I know it sounds ridiculous, but imagine if the student didn't make that connection between, oh, she says the word can, she squirts me. They're not going to have a conditioned response then. They're not going to flinch every time I say the word can. Whereas, obviously, students that actually make that connection, oh, every time she says can, she squirts me, at least in the beginning, that actually has a conditioned response. So it depends upon the, it actually works better when people actually understand the relationship and actually figured it out. And lastly, species only learn behaviors that increase its chances of survival, and those things that help them adapt. So Garcia, that's Garcia, did an experiment with rats, and he took a look at feeding them something that caused them to get sick. And so he actually did this study where he would have something that was very sweet tasting, and then it got the food got them sick, a couple hours later. And looked at whether or not the rat then avoided any food that was sweet tasting, and it did. However, if Garcia also tried with other rats, where he would, in one case, he showed them a light, and then he fed them something that had no specific taste to it, and it got them sick. In another case, he made a noise, this clicking sound, and he fed them this particular item again that made them sick. And the rats would avoid the food that tasted funny, that tasted sweet, but they didn't avoid food when it was preceded by the sound or the light. So he made the case that the rat would use biologically the taste to know what was poison or what was something that was going to make them sick. But biologically, they're not already biologically trained to pay attention to the noise or the light in the case of their food. So since they weren't biologically predisposed to that, they don't pay attention to that. All right, applications of Pavlov. So what can we actually use Pavlov for? So association principle. Association principle is the idea that you associate specific things with specific contexts. For example, I have that guy. You look at him. He is a weatherman, and I'm blanking on his name right now. But you look at him, you're like, oh, you see him, on the street, and you're like, I know that guy. How do I know that guy, right? And then you start to realize, oh, wait a minute, he's on TV, right? He's on the news, okay? But you see him out of context, then you have struggled to make that association. Same thing. The last couple of years, I stayed home with my son. I would go to the Y every day, and I'd see, randomly the same bunch of people. They're just faces in the crowd. But then I would go to the grocery store, or I would go to my daughter's swim meet or something, and I'd run into somebody, and I'd be like, you look familiar. How do I know you? I don't know that I know your name, but because it wasn't in the context that I normally saw them, it took me a while, and you've probably had this instance where I finally put it together. It's like, oh, I see you at the Y all the time. I see you working out all the time. Okay? Same idea. Google. When I ask you to go and research something on the internet, what do you type in? Google, right? People talk about Googling things. They don't talk about searching for things. They talk about Googling things, right? Um, Another idea of association principle, particular logos, the Nike swoosh, for example. That's a logo that you associate with Nike. All right, other applications of Pavlov. John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner. This is Watson, and that's a picture of Rayner with little Albert. And little Albert was a little baby that they conditioned to be afraid of rats. So they took one of his normal responses. So babies are instinctively scared of loud noises. They have that, startle reflex. So Watson took that initial fear of loud noises, and then every time little Albert was exposed to this rat, or like was going to play with this rat, they would go and make a loud noise. And so then he would be startled, and he'd be scared. And it gets to the point where little Albert would associate the rat with being scared without the noise. So again, that's an application of Pavlov. Now, whether or not that's a really ethical thing to do is another story. Later came out that I don't remember where Watson was working for. Watson and Rayner were working for a specific university, but they actually John Watson actually lost his professorship, not because of his experiment, but because he had an affair with Rosalie Rayner. But interestingly enough, after that, Watson went on to work in advertising and sales. And so he actually went and worked on advertising, and he came up with a whole bunch of slogans and used his psychological background to apply to advertising. So again, applications of Pavlov. All right, that ends classical conditioning.